Tom Miller stood frozen in his barn doorway at dawn, staring at the bloody drag marks that led to something moving in the darkness above. What the starving bobcat had pulled through his barn doors during the night would force him to question everything he knew about the ruthless laws of nature. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The October moon hung low over Miller's farm in rural Pennsylvania, casting silver shadows across the weathered barn that had stood for 3 generations. Inside the farmhouse, Tom Miller slept fitfully, unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding in the darkness just beyond his bedroom window. Something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild creatures that shared his land. A desperate mother, driven by instincts deeper than survival itself, was about to make a choice that would leave an entire community questioning the boundaries between wild and tame, between fear and compassion, between what nature demands and what the heart allows. The scratching started around midnight. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the wind that whistled through the gaps in the old barn's wooden planks. But it was persistent, rhythmic, the sound of something being dragged across rough ground with determined effort. If anyone had been awake to hear it, they might have dismissed it as branches scraping against the barn's exterior, or perhaps a raccoon rummaging through the property. But this was something far more remarkable. In the pale moonlight, a spotted form moved with singular purpose, pulling something heavy behind her, stopping every few feet to rest before continuing her exhausting journey. Tom Miller was 58 years old and had been farming his family's land since he was barely old enough to drive a tractor. At 6'2" with broad shoulders earned from decades of physical labor, he cut an imposing figure, though his weathered face and kind brown eyes told the story of a man who had learned gentleness from working with animals all his life. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving him alone in the sprawling farmhouse with only his border collie Jasper for company. His daughter Emily, a veterinarian practicing in Philadelphia, called every Sunday without fail, but the farm felt emptier than it ever had in all his years there. The 100-acre property had been in the Miller family since 1897, passed down from Tom's great-grandfather, who had cleared the land with nothing but determination and a team of horses. The main barn, a magnificent structure of hand-hewn beams and fieldstone foundation, had weathered countless storms and sheltered generations of livestock. Tom had scaled back his operations in recent years, keeping only a small herd of dairy cows, some chickens, and a few goats that Margaret had loved. The upper level of the barn, once packed with hay, now stood mostly empty, its vast space home to nothing but swallows' nests and the occasional barn owl. On this particular night, Tom had gone to bed early, exhausted from repairing fence posts along the northern property line. He had noticed signs of wildlife activity lately, tracks near the creek that suggested a bobcat had taken up residence somewhere in the wooded areas bordering his farm. Pennsylvania's bobcat population had been making a steady recovery, and while Tom appreciated seeing the native wildlife return, he also knew to be cautious. A hungry predator could wreak havoc on his chickens, and he had already lost 2 hens the previous month to what he suspected was a fox. What Tom didn't know was that the bobcat whose tracks he had seen was far more than just another predator passing through his property. She was a young female, barely 3 years old, and she was carrying something far more precious than any meal she might hunt. Beneath her spotted coat, swollen with late-stage pregnancy, she carried the next generation, but she also carried a burden that transcended her own species, a weight that spoke to something universal in the language of motherhood. The bobcat had been watching the farm for weeks, observing the rhythms of human activity from the safety of the tree line. She had learned when the farmer emerged each morning, when he tended his animals, when lights went out in the farmhouse. She had studied the barn with particular interest, noting how its doors often stood slightly ajar, how it offered shelter from the increasing cold of autumn nights. Most importantly, she had seen that it was largely unused, a safe haven that the humans rarely entered after sunset. Her own den, a hollow beneath a fallen oak tree 2 miles into the woods, had been compromised when a black bear had wandered too close, investigating the area for its own winter preparations. The disturbance had forced her to abandon what should have been a perfect birthing site, and with her time drawing near, she needed to find shelter quickly. The approaching winter promised to be harsh, and her weakened condition from weeks of inadequate hunting made her desperate. She was starving, her ribs visible beneath her coat despite the pregnancy, her movements slower than they should be for a predator in her prime. But it wasn't her own condition that drove her on this moonlit night. It wasn't even the urgent need to find a safe place for her imminent delivery. What pulled her forward, step by exhausting step, was something she carried in her jaws, something that weighed her down and made her journey infinitely more difficult. Something that by all laws of nature she should have ignored or worse. Yet here she was, dragging her precious cargo across open ground, risking exposure and exhaustion, driven by an instinct that transcended the boundaries of her own species. The barn door stood partially open, just as she had observed during her reconnaissance. She paused at the threshold, her keen senses alert for any sign of danger. The familiar sense of hay, livestock, and old wood filled her nostrils. More importantly, there was no fresh scent of the human or his dog. Satisfied, she resumed her task, pulling her burden through the opening and into the shadowy interior. The journey up the wooden ramp to the barn's second level took the last of her strength, but she persevered, knowing that height meant safety, that elevation meant protection from ground-dwelling threats. By the time the moon reached its zenith, she had completed her mission. In the far corner of the barn's upper level, hidden behind stacks of old wooden crates and forgotten equipment, she had created a sanctuary. And there, in the darkness, she finally released what she had been carrying. The sound that emerged was not what one might expect from a wild predator's catch. It was something that would have stopped Tom Miller's heart if he had heard it. Something that would change everything when dawn finally broke over Miller's farm. Tom woke to Jasper's urgent whining at 5:30 in the morning, earlier than usual even for a farm dog with a reliable internal clock. The border collie stood at the bedroom door, his black and white coat catching the dim light from the hallway, his brown eyes fixed on his master with an intensity that spoke of something more than routine morning hunger. Tom groaned and swung his legs out of bed, his joints protesting the cold October air that had seeped into the old farmhouse overnight. He reached for his flannel robe, the one Margaret had given him their last Christmas together, and shuffled into his worn boots. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the kind of morning that Margaret would have called breathtaking. Tom stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the crisp autumn air, watching his breath form small clouds in the cold. Jasper danced impatiently at his feet, then bolted toward the barn, which was unusual behavior for a dog that typically waited for his master's lead during morning chores. Tom frowned, his farmer's instincts immediately alert to anything out of the ordinary. The barn door stood wider than he remembered leaving it, though he had to admit his memory wasn't what it used to be. He had been distracted the night before, preoccupied with thoughts of Emily's upcoming visit and the repairs that still needed finishing before winter truly set in. Jasper had already disappeared inside, and Tom could hear the dog's excited barking echoing through the structure's interior. That was definitely not normal. Jasper was trained to be calm around livestock, and this level of agitation suggested something unexpected. Tom quickened his pace, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flashlight he kept just inside the barn entrance. The interior was dim despite the growing daylight outside, the high windows of the old structure allowing only filtered illumination to reach the ground floor. The cows in their stalls shifted nervously, responding to Jasper's continued barking from somewhere above. Tom's heart rate increased as he realized the sound was coming from the upper level, the area he rarely visited anymore since he no longer stored hay there. The wooden stairs that led to the second floor creaked under his weight, each step echoing in the vast space. He could hear Jasper now, not just barking but whining, the kind of sound the dog made when he encountered something that confused rather than threatened him. Tom reached the top of the stairs and swept his flashlight across the dusty expanse. Jasper stood about 30 feet away, near the far corner behind the old equipment, his tail wagging uncertainly as he looked back at Tom and then toward whatever had captured his attention. Tom approached slowly, his boots loud against the wooden planks. His flashlight beam caught movement, something that made him freeze mid-step. A pair of glowing eyes reflected back at him from the darkness, yellow-green and unmistakably feline. The bobcat was larger than he expected. Though he could see, even in the poor light, that she was emaciated, her spotted coat stretched over visible ribs. But it was her position that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. She was curled protectively around something, her body forming a living barrier between Tom and whatever lay behind her. The bobcat didn't flee, which was Tom's first indication that something was very wrong. Wild bobcats avoided humans at all costs, yet this one held her ground despite the presence of a full-grown man and a dog. Her ears were flattened against her skull, and a low growl rumbled from her throat, but there was something desperate rather than aggressive in her posture. She was guarding something, protecting it with the fierce determination of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Tom slowly knelt down, making himself smaller and less threatening. He called Jasper to his side, and the well-trained dog obeyed immediately, though he continued to whine softly. Tom's eyes had adjusted to the dim light, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. Behind the bobcat, nestled against her swollen belly, were 5 tiny shapes, but they weren't bobcat kittens. The sounds they made, weak mewing cries that grew stronger as they responded to the commotion, were unmistakably domestic. They were barn kittens, probably no more than a few days old, their eyes still closed, their fur matted and damp. Tom sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The starving, heavily pregnant bobcat hadn't come to his barn to hunt his chickens or raid his livestock. She had come here carrying a litter of abandoned kittens in her mouth, one by one if the timeline made sense, dragging them to safety with the last of her strength. The implications of such behavior made his throat tight with emotion. This went against everything he understood about wild predators. Bobcats were solitary hunters, fiercely territorial, driven by survival instincts that should have made them see smaller felines as competition or even prey. Yet here was undeniable evidence of something different. The kittens, clearly domestic barn cats based on their coloring, showed no signs of injury. The bobcat had carried them carefully, placed them in the warmest corner she could find, and now guarded them as fiercely as if they were her own offspring. Tom noticed something else that made the scene even more poignant. There was an old horse blanket in the corner. One he had forgotten was stored up here, and the bobcat had arranged it into a crude nest. She had prepared a birthing place not just for herself but for the orphaned kittens she had rescued. Tom remained motionless, watching as the bobcat's attention shifted between him and the kittens. He could see her sides heaving with exhaustion, could see the way her body trembled with weakness. She had expended energy she couldn't afford to save creatures that nature had programmed her to ignore. His years of working with animals told him she was close to giving birth herself, that the stress of her rescue mission might even have triggered early labor. The question now was what he should do about it. Moving slowly, Tom backed toward the stairs, never taking his eyes off the bobcat. She watched him go but didn't move from her protective position. Tom descended the stairs with Jasper at his heels, his mind racing through options. Every instinct told him to call wildlife control, to let professionals handle a wild predator that had taken up residence in his barn. But something held him back. The image of that starving mother, protecting kittens that weren't her own, spoke to something deeper than protocol or common sense. Instead of reaching for his phone, Tom found himself walking to his storage shed where he kept supplies for the rare times he bottle-fed orphaned farm animals. Tom's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he gathered what he needed from the storage shed, though his mind churned with the impossibility of what he had just witnessed. He filled a large bowl with fresh water, grabbed several cans of wet cat food that he kept on hand for the barn cats that helped control the rodent population, and located a container of kitten formula powder that was thankfully still within its expiration date. Margaret had always insisted on keeping such supplies stocked, her nurturing instinct extending to every creature on the farm, and Tom had maintained the habit even after her passing. The walk back to the barn felt surreal, as if he were moving through a dream. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the farm in golden October light that made everything seem peaceful and ordinary. But nothing about this morning was ordinary. Tom paused at the barn entrance, considering his approach. He couldn't just barge in and expect the Bobcat to accept his help. Wild animals operated on instinct and fear, and a cornered predator protecting young was one of the most dangerous situations he could face. He left Jasper outside this time, despite the dog's protests. The border collie's presence, however well-intentioned, would only add stress to an already tense situation. Tom climbed the stairs slowly, making deliberate noise to announce his presence, giving the Bobcat time to prepare for his arrival rather than startling her. When he reached the top, he found her in the same position, though if anything she looked more exhausted than before. Her yellow-green eyes tracked his movements with fierce intensity. But Tom noticed something he had missed earlier. She wasn't just protecting the kittens. She was leaning against them, drawing what little warmth their tiny bodies could provide. Tom set down his supplies about 15 feet away from the Bobcat, well outside what he estimated was her comfort zone. He spoke softly as he worked, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used when working with skittish livestock. He told her about Margaret, about how his wife would have loved to see something like this, about how she had always believed animals were capable of more compassion than most people gave them credit for. The words themselves didn't matter, but the tone did, creating a soundscape of calm rather than threat. He opened the cat food cans slowly, the metallic sound causing the Bobcat's ears to prick forward with interest despite her defensive posture. Tom placed several generous portions on a shallow dish and slid it gently across the floor, stopping it about 10 feet from the Bobcat. Then he prepared the water bowl, setting it near the food. The Bobcat watched every movement, her body tense, but Tom could see the hunger warring with her protective instincts. She needed to eat. She desperately needed water. But leaving the kittens exposed felt wrong to her, went against every maternal impulse driving her behavior. Tom retreated to the stairs and sat down on the top step, making himself as non-threatening as possible. He pulled out his phone, not to call anyone but to occupy himself, to show through his body language that he posed no immediate threat. The Bobcat remained motionless for several long minutes. Then slowly, cautiously, she began to move. She didn't abandon her post entirely, but stretched toward the food, her body still partially covering the kittens as she strained to reach the dish. It was almost painful to watch her struggle, to see her torn between her own survival needs and her protective drive. Finally, hunger won out. She lunged for the food, eating with desperate speed, pausing every few seconds to look back at the kittens and then at Tom. The water disappeared almost as quickly as the food, and Tom could see the immediate effect it had on her. The trembling in her limbs lessened slightly, and some of the wildness left her eyes, replaced by a more calculated wariness. Tom waited until she had finished eating before he moved again. This time he prepared a bottle of formula, mixing it according to the instructions on the container, testing its temperature against his wrist the way Emily had shown him years ago when they had raised an orphaned calf together. The kittens needed to eat too, and while the bobcat's maternal instincts might allow her to nurse them temporarily, she was too malnourished to produce adequate milk for 5 hungry mouths on top of the litter she was carrying. The question was how to feed them without getting too close to their fierce protector. Tom had an idea, risky but potentially workable. He called down the stairs for Jasper, and the border collie bounded up immediately, his tail wagging with relief at being included again. Tom gave him a series of commands, simple ones the dog had known since puppyhood, using him as an intermediary to place the bottle near the kittens without Tom himself having to approach. The bobcat watched this maneuver with obvious confusion, her head tilting slightly as the dog carefully carried the bottle in his mouth and placed it near the kittens before retreating to Tom's side. It was perhaps the strangest collaboration of species Tom had ever witnessed, and he made a mental note to tell Emily about it, knowing she would hardly believe him without photographic evidence, but in this moment getting proof seemed far less important than ensuring the survival of everyone involved. One of the kittens, slightly larger than its siblings and marked with orange tabby stripes, had begun to cry more insistently, its tiny mouth opening and closing in search of food. The sound seemed to trigger something in the bobcat, some deep maternal response that transcended species barriers. She looked at the bottle, then at the kitten, then back at Tom, with what he could have sworn was a question in her eyes. "Can I trust you? Will you hurt them if I let my guard down?" Tom remained perfectly still, barely breathing, watching as the bobcat made her decision. She reached out with one large paw and batted the bottle closer to the kittens, then nosed the orange tabby toward it. The kitten's seeking mouth found the nipple, and soon the sound of contented nursing filled the quiet space. The bobcat settled back, watching the kitten feed, and gradually, one by one, she helped the other kittens find their way to the bottle as well. Tom felt tears prick at his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. In his 5 decades of farming, he had seen countless births, had helped animals through difficult deliveries, had bottle-fed orphans, and nursed sick livestock back to health. But he had never seen anything like this. The barriers between species, between wild and domestic, between natural enemies, had dissolved in the face of something more fundamental. The bobcat had saved these kittens from certain death, had brought them to the safest place she could find, and now she was accepting help from a human to keep them alive. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of the barn, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Tom sat on the stairs with Jasper pressed against his leg, watching the impossible scene unfold before him. The starving bobcat, her belly swollen with her own imminent delivery, lay curled around 5 domestic kittens, keeping them warm while they fed. And in that moment, Tom understood that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. This wasn't just about helping a wild animal in need. This was about bearing witness to something profound, something that would challenge assumptions about nature, compassion, and the invisible threads that connected all living things. He thought about Margaret, about how she would have handled this situation with her characteristic blend of practical care and emotional wisdom. She would have known exactly what to do, would have already been planning the next steps while Tom was still processing the reality of it all. But Margaret was gone, and this was his responsibility now. His decision would determine whether this remarkable story ended in triumph or tragedy. Tom spent the next 3 hours in the barn, moving with patient deliberation as he established a routine that might sustain this fragile situation. He made 2 more trips to retrieve supplies, each time announcing his presence well before reaching the top of the stairs, giving the bobcat time to prepare for his arrival. She was learning, he noticed, her initial defensive posture softening incrementally with each visit. She no longer growled when he appeared, though her eyes never left him, tracking his every movement with predatory precision. that reminded him she was still very much a wild animal. By mid-morning, Tom had created a system that allowed him to provide care without directly approaching the makeshift den. He set up a pulley mechanism using rope and an old basket, something he had used years ago to move supplies to the upper level when it had been full of hay. Now it served a different purpose, allowing him to send up food, water, and fresh bottles of formula without climbing the stairs and stressing the Bobcat with his presence. It was clumsy but effective, and more importantly, it gave her a sense of control over the situation. The kittens were thriving as much as could be expected given their circumstances. Tom had managed to get a closer look during one of his visits when the Bobcat had been distracted by eating. They appeared to be about 3 or 4 days old, their eyes still sealed shut, their tiny ears just beginning to unfold. 3 were various shades of gray and white. One was the orange tabby that had fed first, and the smallest was solid black with a tiny white patch on its chest. Tom found himself wondering about their mother, about what had happened to leave them abandoned in a location where a Bobcat had found them instead of a human. The most likely scenario, Tom reasoned, was that a barn cat from a neighboring property had given birth somewhere in the woods and had either died or been killed before she could move her litter to safety. Bobcats were solitary hunters with territories spanning several square miles. This female must have come across the kittens during her desperate search for food and shelter. But finding them was one thing. What she had done next defied everything Tom knew about wildlife behavior. She had carried them one by one across what must have been a significant distance, using energy she couldn't spare, driven by instincts that shouldn't have recognized domestic kittens as anything worth saving. Tom called Emily around noon, needing to share the burden of this secret with someone who would understand its significance. His daughter answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright with the particular kind of energy that meant she was between appointments at the clinic. "Dad, perfect timing. I just finished with a Great Dane who ate an entire loaf of bread still in the plastic bag. Can you believe people sometimes?" Tom smiled despite himself. I need you to listen to something and not interrupt until I'm finished. It's important." The tone of his voice must have conveyed his seriousness because Emily immediately went quiet, and Tom could almost picture her setting down whatever she had been doing to give him her full attention. He told her everything, starting with Jasper's unusual behavior that morning and ending with the current situation in the barn. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Tom checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Dad," Emily finally said, her voice careful and measured in the way that meant she was thinking through multiple scenarios at once. "Dad, you need to call Wildlife Services. This is beyond what you can handle alone. A pregnant bobcat is dangerous, especially one that's been exhibiting unusual behavior. She could go into labor at any time, and there's no telling how she'll react with both her own kittens and those domestic cats present." Tom had expected this response, had prepared his argument during the hours of watching and waiting. "I know what I should do, Em, but I'm telling you, if we bring in strangers with nets and tranquilizers, if we traumatize her any more than she already has been, she might abandon all of them. Or worse. I've seen animals do terrible things when they're cornered and terrified. Right now we have a delicate balance. She's accepting my help, or at least tolerating it. That's more than we could hope for under normal circumstances." "These aren't normal circumstances," Emily countered. "Dad, I love that you want to help, but you're romanticizing wild animal behavior. Bobcats don't adopt domestic kittens. It's probably just seeking warmth from them, using them as living hot water bottles until she gives birth. Once her own kittens arrive, her hormones will shift, and those domestic cats will become competition for resources at best and a potential threat at worst." Tom bristled at the suggestion that he was being naive. He might not have Emily's veterinary degree, but he knew animals. "I'm watching her clean them, Em. Actual grooming behavior. She noses them toward the bottle when they cry. That's not just seeking warmth, that's maternal care, and you know it." There was another long pause, and Tom pressed his advantage. "Come up this weekend like you planned. See for yourself. If you still think we need to call it in after you've observed her behavior, I'll make the call myself." Emily sighed, and Tom recognized the sound of his daughter wrestling with her professional training and her respect for his experience. "All right, but I'm leaving Friday afternoon instead of Saturday morning. And Dad, promise me you'll be careful. Keep Jasper away from the barn. Don't try to approach her directly. And for God's sake, if she goes into labor, stay downstairs. Birthing animals can be unpredictable, and a bobcat is not a cow or a horse. She has teeth and claws designed to kill things much larger than you." "I promise," Tom said, meaning it. He had no intention of putting himself in unnecessary danger, but he also couldn't bring himself to abandon the situation. After he hung up with Emily, Tom returned to the barn with another load of supplies. The bobcat had moved slightly, arranging herself in a way that gave him a clear view of her swollen belly. Tom's experienced eye told him Emily was right about the timing. This bobcat would give birth within the next 24 to 48 hours at most. The afternoon passed in a strange rhythm of ordinary farm chores, punctuated by trips to check on the barn's unusual occupants. Tom fed his cows, collected eggs from the chickens, and made notes about fence sections that still needed repair before winter. But his mind remained fixed on the second floor of the barn, on the pregnant wildcat caring for orphaned kittens, on the impossible situation that had somehow become his responsibility. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the farm, Tom made one final trip up the stairs. The bobcat was restless now, pacing in a small circle around the kittens, pausing occasionally to lick her own flanks. Tom recognized the signs immediately. Labor was beginning, the ancient process that had repeated itself countless times across countless species since the beginning of life itself. But this instance was different, complicated by the presence of 5 tiny lives that had no biological connection to the mother preparing to give birth. Tom retreated quickly, not wanting his presence to add stress during such a critical time. He set up a comfortable chair at the bottom of the stairs, wrapped himself in a heavy blanket, and settled in for what he suspected would be a long night. Jasper curled up at his feet, the dog's warm presence a comfort in the darkening barn. Above them, nature prepared to unfold in ways that would challenge everything Tom thought he understood about maternal instinct, species boundaries, and the capacity for compassion in creatures we too often dismissed as operating purely on primitive drives. The moon rose outside, the same moon that had witnessed the bobcat's desperate journey the night before, and in the quiet of the Pennsylvania countryside, a lonely farmer waited for dawn, wondering what impossible things the morning light would reveal. The sounds started around 2 in the morning, low vocalizations that drifted down from the upper level of the barn and pulled Tom from his restless half-sleep. They were unlike anything he had heard before, not quite growls, but not purrs either, something primal and ancient that spoke to the universal experience of birth. Jasper's ears perked up, but the dog remained calm, pressed against Tom's leg as if sensing the gravity of what was happening above them. Tom resisted the urge to climb the stairs and check on the situation. Every instinct born from decades of helping animals through difficult deliveries urged him to intervene, to offer assistance, but his rational mind knew that his presence would only cause harm. The bobcat needed privacy, needed to feel safe and secure to let her body do what nature had designed it to do. So Tom stayed where he was, listening to the sounds of new life entering the world, feeling helpless and awed in equal measure. The process took nearly 4 hours. Tom tracked time by the gradual shift in the quality of darkness outside the barn windows, watching as black softened to deep blue and then to the pale gray that preceded dawn. The vocalizations from above changed character as the night progressed, becoming more urgent at times, then falling into periods of quiet that worried Tom more than the sounds themselves. He had attended enough births to know that silence could mean complications, but he forced himself to remain patient, to trust that the bobcat's body knew what to do. As the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the barn's upper windows, a new sound joined the others. It was high-pitched and reedy, the unmistakable cry of a newborn kitten. Tom felt his chest tighten with emotion, relief flooding through him like a physical force. The first cry was followed by another, and then another, each voice distinct and demanding. The bobcat's own kittens had arrived, and they were making their presence known to the world. Tom waited another hour before attempting to climb the stairs, wanting to give the mother time to clean her newborns and establish nursing. When he finally ascended, moving with exaggerated care to announce his presence, the scene that greeted him took his breath away. The bobcat lay on her side, her body curled in a protective C-shape. Against her belly, barely visible in the dim morning light, were 4 tiny spotted forms, their fur still damp and dark, their eyes sealed shut just like the domestic kittens that surrounded them. She had arranged them together. That was the detail that struck Tom with the force of revelation. The bobcat hadn't separated her biological offspring from the domestic kittens she had rescued. Instead, she had integrated them into a single group, creating what appeared to be a unified litter of 9 kittens. The newborn bobcat kittens were noticeably smaller than the domestic cats, despite being the same species as their mother, a reminder that bobcats, while larger than house cats as adults, started life at a similar size. The mother herself looked exhausted but alert, her yellow-green eyes tracking Tom's movements as he carefully placed fresh food and water at his usual distance. He had also brought a heating pad, one designed for outdoor use, thinking that the extra warmth might help the newborns regulate their body temperature in the drafty barn. He plugged it into an extension cord and slid it across the floor, watching as the bobcat sniffed it suspiciously before seeming to accept it as another of the strange human's offerings. Tom noticed something else that made his throat tight with emotion. The orange tabby kitten, the one that had been first to feed the previous day, was nestled directly against one of the newborn bobcat kittens, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth. The visual of spotted wild fur against orange domestic fur should have been jarring, a violation of natural order, but instead it seemed perfectly right, as if this was exactly how things were meant to be. He took several photos with his phone, knowing Emily would want documentation but also needing evidence for himself, proof that this impossible thing was really happening. The images wouldn't fully capture what he was witnessing, couldn't convey the profound sense of witnessing something that transcended normal animal behavior. But they would serve as a starting point for the conversation he knew was coming, the one where he would have to convince his daughter that what her professional training told her was impossible was unfolding right before them. As Tom descended the stairs, his mind was already working through the logistics of the situation. 9 kittens were too many for even a healthy mother to care for alone, and this bobcat was far from healthy. She was emaciated, stressed, and had just endured a difficult birth in unfamiliar territory. The domestic kittens were slightly older and therefore stronger, which meant they might outcompete the newborn bobcats for nursing access. Tom would need to supplement feeding, would need to monitor all 9 kittens carefully to ensure each was getting adequate nutrition. The bigger question, the one that loomed over everything else, was what would happen in the coming weeks. Bobcat kittens developed quickly, their wild instincts emerging as they grew. The domestic cats would mature at a different rate, their personalities shaped by generations of domestication. How long could this unusual family unit remain stable? And what would Tom do when the inevitable complications arose? He spent the morning setting up a more permanent monitoring system, rigging an old baby monitor he found in the farmhouse attic so he could listen for signs of distress without constantly climbing the stairs. The audio feed was poor quality, full of static and odd echoes, but it was better than nothing. Through the crackling speaker, Tom could hear the soft sounds of nursing kittens, the occasional rustle of movement, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of the mother's breathing. Tom called Emily again at midday, needing to share the news of the births. She answered quickly, her voice tense with concern. She had clearly been waiting for his call. Did she make it through? The labor? Tom smiled at his daughter's immediate focus on the medical aspects, her veterinary training rising to the forefront even as she tried to maintain professional distance. She did. 4 healthy kittens, as far as I can tell, all nursing strong. And Em, you need to see this. She's integrated them all together. The domestic cats and her own kittens all in one big litter. Emily's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Dad, that's actually not that unusual in some species. Hormones during and after birth can trigger indiscriminate maternal behavior, but it's temporary. As her own kittens develop and her hormone levels normalize, her natural instincts will reassert themselves. You need to be prepared for that. Tom knew his daughter was right from a scientific standpoint, but something in his gut told him this situation was different. He had spent enough time observing the Bobcat to see intelligence in her eyes, intentionality in her actions. I know what you're saying makes sense, Tom replied carefully, but I think you need to see her before we make any decisions. Can you still come up Friday? Emily agreed, though Tom could hear the worry in her voice. As he ended the call, he looked out the kitchen window toward the barn, its weathered structure solid and unchanging against the autumn sky. Inside that barn, something extraordinary was happening, something that would test everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between wild and domestic, about the nature of maternal love, about the capacity for compassion in creatures we assumed operated purely on instinct. The rest of that day passed in a blur of farm chores and constant monitoring. Tom checked on the unusual family every few hours, always maintaining his distance, always respecting the invisible boundary the Bobcat had established. Each time he looked, he found the same remarkable scene. 9 kittens nursing and sleeping in an integrated pile, their mother keeping watch over all of them with equal vigilance. She ate every scrap of food he provided, drank water in quantities that suggested she was producing milk for the entire group, and seemed to be recovering from the birth with remarkable resilience. By Thursday evening, Tom had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though nothing about the situation was remotely ordinary. He woke before dawn to prepare bottles of supplemental formula, climbed the stairs to leave food and water, and checked the baby monitor throughout the day for any signs of distress. The Bobcat had stopped growling at his appearances, though she watched him with unblinking attention, her body language still wary but no longer overtly defensive. It was a tentative truce, fragile and conditional, but it held. The kittens were thriving in ways that both relieved and amazed Tom. The domestic cats, with their 3-day head start on development, were noticeably more active than the newborn Bobcat kittens, their tiny bodies wiggling and crawling with increasing coordination. The Bobcat young, by contrast, were still in that early stage of helpless dependency, their movements mostly limited to rooting for milk and the occasional stretch of miniature limbs. Yet the mother showed no preference, grooming all 9 with the same methodical attention, responding to the cries of domestic and wild kittens with equal urgency. Tom had begun to notice distinct personalities emerging even in these early days. The orange tabby, whom Tom had started calling Rusty in his mind, was bold and demanding, always first to find the milk whether from bottle or mother. The tiny black kitten with the white chest patch, Shadow, was the opposite, quiet and often found at the edges of the pile until her siblings shifted and made room. The 3 gray and white domestic cats formed a little cluster within the larger group, while the 4 Bobcat kittens seemed content wherever they ended up in the constantly rearranging pile of fur and tiny paws. What struck Tom most forcefully was the Bobcat mother's patience. He had raised enough litters of farm animals to know that motherhood was exhausting under the best circumstances. a constant drain of physical and emotional resources. This bobcat was managing 9 demanding infants, while still recovering from birth, still dealing with malnutrition, still adjusting to the stress of living in an enclosed space near humans. By all rights, she should have been irritable, selective about which kittens received her attention, perhaps even aggressive toward the domestic cats that weren't biologically hers. Instead, she exhibited a serenity that seemed almost supernatural. Friday morning arrived with a cold rain that drummed against the barn's metal roof and turned the farm roads into ribbons of mud. Tom was checking the upper level when he heard the distinctive sound of Emily's truck pulling into the driveway earlier than he had expected. She must have left Philadelphia before dawn to arrive by 8 in the morning. He hurried down the stairs to meet her, feeling a complicated mix of relief at having her expertise and anxiety about what she might insist they do. Emily stepped out of her truck wearing muddy boots and a worn canvas jacket, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she had favored since high school. She hugged Tom briefly, then pulled back to look at him with the assessing gaze of a medical professional checking a patient. "You look exhausted, Dad. Have you been sleeping?" Tom shrugged, knowing there was no point in lying to someone who could read him as easily as Emily could. "Some. I've been monitoring them through the night, making sure there are no complications." Emily grabbed her veterinary bag from the truck, and Tom noticed she had brought additional supplies, formula and bottles, medications, even a small cage that could be used for transport. She was preparing for multiple scenarios, he realized, including the one where she convinced him they needed to separate the kittens and call in wildlife services. His jaw tightened with determination. She needed to see what he had seen, needed to understand that this wasn't a temporary hormone-induced behavior, but something deeper. They walked to the barn together, Emily's professional demeanor firmly in place. Tom briefed her on the situation as they walked, providing details about feeding schedules, the mother's condition, and his observations of how she interacted with the mixed litter. Emily listened without interrupting, but Tom could see the skepticism in her eyes, the way her lips pressed together in that particular expression that meant she was withholding judgment until she had examined the evidence herself. At the bottom of the barn stairs, Tom put a hand on Emily's arm. "She's going to react to you differently than she does to me. We've established a routine, but you're new. We need to go slowly, let her get used to your presence." Emily nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I know how to approach wildlife, Dad. I do this for a living." Tom smiled apologetically. "I know, kiddo. I just want you to understand how delicate this balance is." They climbed the stairs together, Tom leading the way. As they approached the corner where the bobcat had made her den, Emily's sharp intake of breath told Tom she had spotted the unusual family. The bobcat's ears flattened at the appearance of a stranger, and a low warning growl rumbled from her chest, but she didn't move from her protective position curled around the pile of kittens. Tom could see Emily taking in every detail with her trained eye, cataloging the mother's physical condition, counting the kittens, observing their arrangement and behavior. They stood in silence for several long minutes, just watching. The rain continued to drum on the roof above them, creating a white noise that somehow made the scene feel even more intimate. Tom saw the moment when Emily's professional skepticism began to crack, when the evidence before her eyes started to override what her training told her was impossible. It was subtle, a slight relaxation in her shoulders, a softening around her eyes, but Tom knew his daughter well enough to recognize the shift. One of the bobcat kittens had begun to mew, a tiny sound of hunger or discomfort. The mother immediately responded with a soft chirp and shifted to give the kitten better access to nurse. But in moving, she displaced the little black domestic cat, Shadow, who began to cry in turn. Without hesitation, the bobcat nosed Shadow back into the pile and repositioned herself so both kittens could nurse comfortably. It was such a small gesture, so automatic and natural. But Tom heard Emily's breath catch as she witnessed it. They retreated down the stairs without speaking, and Tom led Emily to the farmhouse kitchen where he had coffee waiting. They sat at the old wooden table, the same one where Tom had shared countless meals with Margaret, where Emily had done her homework as a child, where family decisions had always been made. Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, staring into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "That's not normal," she finally said, her voice quiet. "Dad, nothing about what I just saw is normal. Bobcats are solitary animals. They're territorial. Their maternal instincts should be highly specific to their own offspring, especially this soon after giving birth. The hormones that drive maternal behavior are species-specific for a reason. What she's doing, it shouldn't be possible." Tom took a sip of his own coffee, letting Emily work through her thoughts without interruption. "But she's doing it anyway," Emily continued. "She's nursing domestic kittens. She's integrating them into her litter completely. She's not just tolerating them or using them for warmth. She's actively caring for them as if they were her own." Tom leaned forward, his voice earnest. "So what do we do?" Emily met his eyes, and Tom saw the internal struggle playing out across her face. She was torn between her training, which surely told her to call wildlife services, and the evidence of something extraordinary happening right here on the farm. By the book, we should contact the state wildlife department. This bobcat should be in a rehabilitation facility where she can be properly monitored and eventually released back into the wild. The domestic kittens should be taken to a shelter where they can be socialized and adopted out. "And what does that do to her?" Tom asked quietly. "What does it do to the kittens she rescued?" "We separate a family she fought so hard to create. We traumatize an already stressed animal, and we destroy what might be one of the most remarkable examples of interspecies compassion anyone has ever witnessed." Emily rubbed her temples, the gesture so reminiscent of Margaret that Tom's heart ached. "You're asking me to go against every protocol I've been trained to follow. I could lose my license if something goes wrong. If she becomes aggressive, if the kittens aren't getting proper nutrition, if there are health complications we're not equipped to handle here." Tom reached across the table and took Emily's hand, the way he had done when she was a little girl facing difficult decisions. "I'm not asking you to abandon your professional judgment. I'm asking you to use it. You're the expert here, Em. You tell me what they need and I'll make it happen. We can monitor them closely, weigh the kittens daily, watch for any signs of distress or malnutrition. At the first indication that something's wrong, we make the call, but give them a chance, give her a chance to show us what's possible." Emily was quiet for a long moment, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Finally, she looked up at Tom with an expression that combined resignation and determination in equal measure. 1 week. We monitor them intensively for 1 week. I'll stay here, work remotely as much as possible, and we assess their condition daily. But Dad, at the first sign of trouble, any indication that the mother is stressed or the kittens aren't thriving, we contact wildlife services. No arguments. Tom felt relief wash through him like a warm wave. "Thank you, kiddo. You won't regret this." "I already regret it," Emily said, but there was a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Mom would have loved this, wouldn't she?" Tom nodded, his throat suddenly tight. She would have been out there every hour, taking notes, probably trying to write a book about it. Emily laughed softly. "And she would have already named all 9 of them despite your protests about not getting attached." Tom had to admit his daughter was right. Margaret had never met an animal she didn't immediately christen with an elaborate name that usually had some historical or literary significance. They spent the rest of the morning setting up a proper monitoring system. Emily brought in a digital scale, accurate enough to track small weight changes, a better camera for documenting the kitten's development, and medical supplies that Tom hadn't even known existed. She created a chart for tracking each kitten individually, assigning them numbers for clinical documentation, even though Tom noticed she had also included spaces for names. Old habits apparently ran in the family. Their first official assessment happened around noon. Emily insisted on a methodical approach, starting with observing the mother from a distance to gauge her stress levels and physical condition. The Bobcat watched them with those intense yellow-green eyes, but she didn't exhibit the aggressive posturing she had shown when Emily first arrived. If anything, she seemed to have accepted that the female human was part of Tom's routine, an extension of the care that had been keeping her and her charges fed and safe. Emily made detailed notes, her veterinary training evident in the precision of her observations. "The mother's weight is critically low," she murmured, more to herself than to Tom. "I'd estimate she's about 15 pounds, which is at least 5 to 7 pounds under what she should be for a female of her size. But her coat is in better condition than I expected, given her malnourishment. Tom must have been providing high-quality protein." Tom felt a small surge of pride at his daughter's approval, even though he knew the situation was far from resolved. The kittens were next. Emily used a technique she had clearly employed many times before, speaking in a low, soothing voice as she slowly approached the den area. The Bobcat tensed, but didn't retreat or attack. Emily worked quickly, her hands gentle but efficient, as she lifted each kitten for a brief examination and weighing. Tom held his breath during each interaction, acutely aware that they were handling a wild animal's offspring, crossing boundaries that nature had established over millennia of evolution. The domestic kittens averaged about 7 ounces each, Emily reported as she carefully returned them to the pile. "That's good, right on target for their age. The Bobcat kittens are smaller, around 5 ounces, which is also normal. They're all warm, responsive, and showing good muscle tone. I don't see any signs of dehydration or malnutrition." Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "So they're okay?" "They're more than okay," Emily admitted, and Tom could hear the wonder creeping into her professional tone. "Dad, she's producing enough milk for all 9 of them. I don't know how, given her condition, but she is." They spent the afternoon taking turns watching the unusual family, Emily filling pages with observations while Tom handled his regular farm chores. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and autumn leaves. Tom found himself pausing frequently in his work, looking toward the barn with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Something important was happening there, something that transcended the daily routine of farm life. By evening, Emily had relaxed enough to share some of her theoretical framework for what they were witnessing. Over a dinner of leftover stew, she explained how maternal hormones could sometimes create unexpected behaviors, how stress and survival situations could override normal species-specific instincts. But even as she laid out the scientific explanations, Tom could tell she was grasping for ways to rationalize something that defied easy categorization. "The thing is," Emily said, pushing food around her plate, "there are documented cases of animals adopting young from other species, dogs nursing kittens, cats raising baby squirrels, even wild animals occasionally taking in orphans. But those are usually captive animals or domestic ones with regular human contact. Wild animals, especially predators, just don't do this. Their survival depends on being efficient with their resources, and raising offspring that won't contribute to their genetic line makes no evolutionary sense." Tom took a sip of water, considering his words carefully. Maybe evolution doesn't explain everything. Maybe sometimes an individual animal makes a choice that goes beyond programming. Emily looked at him with an expression that mixed skepticism and hope. "You sound like Mom now. She always said animals were more complex than science gave them credit for." Tom smiled. "Your mother was usually right about things like that." That night, they took turns keeping watch, Emily insisting that they maintain round-the-clock monitoring during this critical first week. Tom took the first shift, settling into his chair at the bottom of the stairs with a book he had no real intention of reading. The barn was quiet, except for the soft sounds filtering down from above, the rustle of movement, the tiny squeaks of nursing kittens, the occasional chirp from the mother as she tended her charges. Around midnight, during Emily's shift, Tom was awakened by her urgent whisper at his bedroom door. "Dad, you need to see this." He stumbled out of bed, his heart racing with worry, but Emily's face showed excitement rather than concern. She led him to the barn, up the stairs, and pointed toward the den area. The bobcat had moved, arranging herself in a new position that gave them a clearer view than ever before, and what Tom saw made his breath catch. The mother was grooming the kittens, which wasn't unusual in itself, but she had organized them in a very specific way. The 4 bobcat kittens formed an inner circle against her belly, while the 5 domestic cats created an outer ring. She methodically cleaned each one, moving from wild to domestic and back again with no apparent preference, but more than that, she was teaching them. As Tom and Emily watched, she would gently mouth one of the kittens, then release it and observe its response. It was play behavior, they realized, the earliest form of social learning that would eventually develop into hunting skills. "She's treating them all the same," Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She's not just feeding them or keeping them warm. She's parenting all 9 of them, as if there's no difference between wild and domestic." Tom nodded, unable to find words for what they were witnessing. In the dim light of the barn, with the autumn night pressing close around them, they were watching something that shouldn't exist, according to everything science understood about animal behavior. Yet here it was, undeniable and extraordinary. The week that followed transformed the Miller farm into something resembling a wildlife research station, with Emily's veterinary equipment scattered across the kitchen table and observation logs filling notebook after notebook. Each morning began with weighing and visual assessments of all 9 kittens, a process that the bobcat mother tolerated with increasing patience. Emily's initial concern about proper nutrition proved unfounded as every kitten showed steady weight gain, their tiny bodies growing rounder and stronger with each passing day. By the 4th day, the domestic kitten's eyes began to open, revealing blue irises that would eventually change color as they matured. Tom found himself spending hours watching them discover their world, their wobbly attempts at movement becoming more coordinated as their muscles developed. The bobcat kittens remained a few days behind in their development, their eyes still sealed, but they were growing at a rate that Emily confirmed was perfectly normal for their species. The mother's milk production was somehow sustaining all 9, a biological feat that Emily admitted she couldn't fully explain. Tom had started calling the bobcat Luna, though he was careful not to use the name in Emily's hearing. His daughter maintained a professional distance, referring to the mother only as the subject or the female, as if clinical language could preserve some boundary between observation and emotional involvement. But Tom noticed the way Emily's expression softened when she watched Luna tend her mixed litter, the way she smiled when the kittens did something particularly endearing. Margaret's daughter, for all her scientific training, had inherited her mother's tender heart. The farm's daily rhythm adjusted to accommodate the unusual residents in the barn. Tom's neighbors had begun to notice his changed routine, the way he spent more time in the barn than usual, the veterinary truck that remained parked in his driveway. Carl Henderson, who farmed the adjacent property, stopped by on Tuesday afternoon with questions poorly disguised as friendly concern. "Everything all right, Tom? Saw your daughter's been visiting. Nothing wrong with the livestock, I hope." Tom had prepared for this moment, knowing that news traveled fast in their rural community. He kept his answer vague but honest. "Had a situation with some orphaned kittens. Emily's been helping me care for them." Carl's weather-beaten face creased with interest. "Kittens, huh? Betty was just saying we could use a good barn cat or 2. Ours passed last winter. Let me know when they're ready to be rehomed." Tom promised he would, though he had no idea what rehoming would look like for kittens raised by a wild bobcat. By midweek, Emily had documented behaviors that she admitted were unprecedented in the veterinary literature she had been consulting. Luna had begun teaching behaviors, gently correcting the kittens when they became too rough with each other, positioning them in specific ways during nursing that seemed designed to establish social hierarchy. Most remarkably, she showed no preference between her biological offspring and the domestic cats she had rescued. If anything, she seemed to give extra attention to Shadow, the smallest and weakest of the domestic kittens, positioning him where he would have the best access to milk. The weather had turned colder, autumn asserting itself with morning frosts that left the grass crunching underfoot. Tom had installed additional heating elements in the barn's upper level, creating a warm microclimate around Luna's den. The bobcat seemed to appreciate these efforts, spending less energy maintaining her body temperature and more on caring for the kittens. Her physical condition was improving dramatically now that she had reliable access to high-quality food and fresh water. The visible ribs that had made Tom wince when he first saw her were gradually disappearing under healthy muscle and fat. Thursday brought an unexpected development that tested everyone's nerves. Tom was in the barn conducting his afternoon check when Luna suddenly stood up, leaving all 9 kittens mewing in distress. She paced to the edge of her den area, her body tense, her attention fixed on something Tom couldn't see. Then he heard it too. The sound of wings flapping, large wings, and the distinctive screech of a hawk. The predatory bird had entered through one of the upper barn windows, likely attracted by the sounds and smells of vulnerable young animals. Tom's farmer's instincts took over. He grabbed a wooden broom handle and waved it at the hawk, shouting to drive it away. The bird wheeled in the confined space, clearly disoriented, before finding the window and escaping back into the autumn sky. When Tom turned around, he found Luna had returned to her kittens, her body curved protectively over them, her eyes watching him with what he could have sworn was gratitude. It was a moment of connection that transcended species, a shared understanding between two beings who had both acted to protect the vulnerable young. Emily arrived minutes later, responding to Tom's text about the incident. She examined all 9 kittens carefully, checking for any signs of distress or injury, but found none. Luna had kept them safe, and Tom's intervention had eliminated the threat before it could escalate. As Emily made notes about the event, Tom noticed her hand was shaking slightly. "That was too close," she said quietly. "If that hawk had gotten to them, if Luna had panicked and scattered the kittens, we could have lost several of them." Tom nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Emily brought up the question they had both been avoiding. "The week is almost up, Dad. We need to talk about what happens next." Tom set down his fork, meeting his daughter's eyes. "They're thriving, Em. Every metric you've measured shows they're healthy and developing normally. Luna is recovering her strength. What argument do we have for disrupting that?" Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression troubled. "The argument is that this isn't sustainable long term. Those bobcat kittens are going to grow into wild animals with wild instincts. The domestic cats will need socialization with humans if they're going to be adoptable. And Luna herself, she should be released back into her natural habitat once the kittens are weaned." Tom knew his daughter was right from a practical standpoint, but something in him rebelled against the idea of separating this unusual family. "They've bonded, Em. You've seen it. Those domestic kittens are learning behaviors from Luna that they would never learn from a domestic cat, and her own kittens are benefiting from the social interaction with a larger peer group. Can't we just see where this goes naturally?" Emily rubbed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "And what happens when the bobcat kittens start showing predatory behavior toward the domestic ones?" What happens when Luna's wild instincts reassert themselves and she sees those barn cats as competitors for resources? These were valid questions, ones Tom didn't have good answers for, but he also knew that what they were witnessing was rare and precious, a glimpse into possibilities that usually remained hidden. If we separate them now, he said slowly, we're making a choice based on fear of what might happen rather than responding to what is happening. Emily met his gaze for a long moment, and Tom saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. Give them 1 more week, she finally said, but we start preparing for eventual separation. We need to begin socializing the domestic kittens with humans, need to start planning for Luna's release. We can't let this go on indefinitely just because it's extraordinary. Tom agreed, knowing it was the most he could hope for. As Emily headed up to bed, exhausted from another long day of monitoring and care, Tom made his usual late-night check on the barn. Luna was nursing the kittens, all 9 of them arranged in their now familiar pattern, their tiny bodies warm and content. The Bobcat looked up as Tom approached, and in that moment of eye contact, Tom felt he understood something fundamental about the nature of compassion. It wasn't limited by species or bound by evolutionary programming. Sometimes, perhaps rarely, but undeniably, an individual creature made choices that transcended survival, that spoke to something deeper and more mysterious than science could easily explain. The second week brought changes that neither Tom nor Emily had fully anticipated. The kittens were growing rapidly now, their personalities emerging more distinctly with each passing day. Rusty, the orange tabby, had become the unofficial leader of the domestic contingent, his bold nature making him first to explore beyond the nest area and first to attempt climbing the wooden crates that bordered their den. The Bobcat kittens, their eyes now open and revealing the distinctive wild gleam of their species, watched these adventures with alert interest, learning through observation what their domestic companions discovered through trial and error. Emily had begun the socialization process she had insisted upon, spending an hour each afternoon sitting near the den and allowing the domestic kittens to approach her on their own terms. It was delicate work, made more complicated by Luna's watchful presence. The Bobcat mother had learned to tolerate Emily's proximity during medical checks, but this extended contact with her charges triggered protective instincts that required careful management. Emily moved slowly, spoke softly, and never tried to handle the kittens when Luna showed signs of stress. Tom noticed something remarkable during these socialization sessions. Luna seemed to understand that Emily's interactions with the domestic kittens were different from her interactions with the Bobcat young. When Emily reached out to the barn cats, encouraging them to sniff her hand or accept gentle touches, Luna would gather her biological offspring closer, as if acknowledging that these were destined for different paths. It was a subtle distinction, but one that suggested a level of cognitive sophistication that neither Tom nor Emily had expected from a wild animal. By the 10th day, the first real crisis emerged. Shadow, the small black domestic kitten who had always been weaker than his siblings, began showing signs of respiratory distress. Emily noticed it during the morning assessment, the slight wheeze in his breathing, the way his tiny chest worked harder than it should. She immediately set up a nebulizer treatment using equipment from her truck, but administering it meant separating Shadow from Luna and the others, which neither of them wanted to do unless absolutely necessary. The solution came from an unexpected source. When Emily approached to take Shadow for treatment, Luna did something extraordinary. She picked up the small kitten in her mouth, carried him to the edge of the den area, and placed him directly in front of Emily. It was a gesture of trust so profound that Tom felt tears spring to his eyes. The wild mother was entrusting them with the care of one of her charges, understanding somehow that they could provide help she could not. Emily worked quickly, administering the treatment while Tom kept Luna calm with soft words and offerings of her favorite food. Shadow responded well to the medication, his breathing easing within hours. When Emily returned him to the den, Luna immediately gathered him close, grooming him with particular attention, as if reassuring herself that he was truly all right. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship with the Bobcat, a threshold cross that transformed their dynamic from cautious coexistence to something resembling partnership. The farm had become a destination for Emily's veterinary colleagues, who arrived in ones and twos throughout the week, drawn by her carefully worded descriptions of an unusual interspecies fostering situation. Dr. Patricia Chen, a wildlife specialist from the State University, spent an entire afternoon documenting Luna's behavior with professional-grade cameras. Her verdict, delivered with academic caution but unmistakable excitement, was that they were witnessing something unprecedented in wildlife behavioral studies. "This isn't just maternal hormones," Dr. Chen explained as they reviewed her footage in Tom's kitchen. "This animal is making active decisions about resource allocation, showing preferential care to the weakest individuals regardless of genetic relationship, and demonstrating social learning behaviors with mixed species offspring. If we can document this properly, it could challenge fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and maternal behavior," but she also added a sobering note. "The question isn't whether this is remarkable, it's how long it can sustainably continue." That question weighed on Tom as the days passed. The Bobcat kittens were developing their wild instincts, their play becoming more aggressive, their movements more predatory. Tom watched as they stalked each other through the den area, their tiny bodies already demonstrating the hunting behaviors that would one day make them apex predators. The domestic kittens, by contrast, engaged in gentler play, batting at bits of hay and wrestling without the focused intensity of their wild siblings. Yet the two groups still integrated seamlessly, sleeping in their mixed pile, nursing from Luna without apparent hierarchy based on species. Rusty had even developed a particular friendship with one of the Bobcat kittens, a female Tom had started calling Sage for her gray-green eyes. The two would be found together more often than not, Sage's wild energy somehow balanced by Rusty's bold confidence. It was as if they had each found something in the other that complemented their own nature. Emily's deadline came and went without either of them acknowledging it explicitly. The kittens were now 3 weeks old, the domestic ones ready to begin eating soft food, the Bobcat kittens not far behind. Luna's condition had improved dramatically, her coat glossy, her movements strong and confident. She was no longer the starving, desperate creature that had dragged orphan kittens into Tom's barn. She was a healthy, capable mother who had somehow managed to nurture 9 demanding offspring through their most vulnerable stage. On the 15th day, Tom woke to find Emily already in the barn, sitting on the stairs with her notebook open, but no words written on the page. He joined her quietly, following her gaze to where Luna and her mixed litter were engaged in what could only be described as a lesson. The Bobcat mother had brought in a dead mouse, likely caught during a brief hunting excursion the night before, and was demonstrating to the kittens how to interact with prey. All 9 watched with rapt attention, though Tom noticed the domestic kittens seemed more interested in batting at the mouse's tail than learning hunting techniques. "We can't keep them together much longer," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. "The Bobcat kittens need to learn to hunt, to develop their wild skills. The domestic ones need continued human socialization. And Luna herself, she should be released before she becomes too habituated to human presence." Tom nodded, knowing she was right but feeling a deep ache at the thought of dismantling this unusual family. "When?" he asked. "Next week," Emily replied. "We'll start separating them gradually. Let Luna keep her biological offspring while we move the domestic kittens to a more controlled environment for socialization." That afternoon, they set up a secondary pen in another part of the barn, designed to house the domestic kittens during the transition period. It was comfortable and safe with heating lamps and soft bedding, everything 5 young barn cats would need. But as Tom looked at the empty space, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to make a terrible mistake. that they were imposing human logic on a situation that had transcended human understanding. The decision about when to make the separation was taken out of their hands by Luna herself. On the 16th day, Tom entered the barn for the morning feeding to find that the Bobcat had already sorted the kittens. The 5 domestic cats were grouped on one side of the den area, while her 4 biological offspring were arranged on the other. She sat between them, her body language making it clear that she had made a choice. It was time. Emily arrived within minutes of Tom's call, her face a mixture of professional interest and deep emotion as she observed what Luna had done. The separation was so deliberate, so intentional, that it defied any explanation based on coincidence or instinct. The Bobcat mother had somehow understood that her charges were destined for different futures, and she was facilitating the transition on her own terms. It was perhaps the most remarkable thing they had witnessed in these extraordinary weeks, and that was saying something given everything that had come before. The transfer of the domestic kittens to their new pen was accomplished with surprising ease. Luna watched but didn't interfere as Emily carefully transported each one, starting with Rusty and ending with Little Shadow. The kittens mewed in confusion at being separated from their wild siblings, but they settled quickly in their new environment, huddling together for comfort just as they had in Luna's den. Tom noticed that Luna kept her own kittens close during the process, grooming them with focused attention, as if preparing them for their next stage of development. Over the following days, the barn became a study in parallel development. The domestic kittens thrived under Emily's careful socialization, learning to associate humans with safety and affection. They were playful, curious, and increasingly confident, their barn cat heritage evident in their fearless exploration of every corner of their enclosure. Carl Henderson came by to meet them, and by the end of his visit, he and his wife Betty had committed to adopting Rusty and one of the gray and white females, whom Emily had finally allowed herself to name Pearl. The Bobcat kittens, meanwhile, were growing into their wild nature under Luna's expert guidance. She brought them small prey items, teaching them the skills they would need to survive in the forest. Tom and Emily maintained their observation protocol, but intervened less and less, recognizing that Luna needed space to prepare her offspring for eventual release. Dr. D. Chen returned twice more to document the process, her research equipment capturing footage that would eventually appear in wildlife journals and documentaries about animal behavior. The question of Luna's release became the subject of careful planning between Emily and the state wildlife department. The goal was to return her and her kittens to a protected area with suitable habitat, far enough from human settlement to ensure they could establish a territory without conflict. Dr. Chen had identified a location in the state forest that met all the criteria, a region with abundant prey and no resident bobcat population that might challenge Luna's presence. 3 weeks after the separation, on a crisp November morning, the day came for Luna and her kittens to leave the barn that had been their sanctuary. The Bobcat kittens were strong and healthy, nearly ready to begin learning to hunt on their own. Luna herself had regained full strength, her body sleek and powerful, showing no signs of the starvation that had driven her to such desperate measures weeks earlier. Tom stood back as the wildlife team, led by Dr. Chen, carefully transported the Bobcat family into specialized carriers designed for their release. Before they loaded the carriers into the transport vehicle, something extraordinary happened. Luna, who had been placed in her carrier first, made a sound that Tom had never heard from her before, a long, mournful cry that seemed to carry both grief and gratitude. The domestic kittens in their pen across the barn responded immediately, their tiny voices joining hers in a chorus that made every human present stand in awed silence. It lasted only a moment, this final communication between the wild mother and the orphans she had saved. But Tom knew he would remember that sound for the rest of his life. The barn felt empty after Luna and her kittens departed, despite the presence of the 5 domestic cats who remained in their pen. Tom found himself climbing to the upper level several times a day, looking at the space where the unusual family had lived, half expecting to see Luna's spotted form curled protectively around her mixed litter. Emily stayed another week to help with the continued socialization of the barn cats, but Tom could see that the departure had affected her deeply as well. The adoptions happened gradually over the following month. Carl and Betty took Rusty and Pearl, promising to send updates and photos. A young family from town adopted 2 of the gray and whites, charmed by their gentle nature and playful energy. Shadow, the smallest and most delicate, went to a retired schoolteacher who had experience with special needs animals and fell in love with his quiet personality. Tom watched each departure with mixed emotions, proud of how well the kittens had developed, but acutely aware of the extraordinary beginning that had shaped their lives. Dr. Chen's tracking data on Luna showed that the Bobcat family had established a successful territory in the state forest. The kittens were learning to hunt, and Luna herself had been observed making several successful kills. The data suggested that all 4 offspring would likely survive to independence, an unusually high success rate that Dr. Chen attributed to Luna's exceptional maternal skills and the extended period of protection she had been able to provide in the barn. 6 months after that October night, when Luna had dragged 5 orphan kittens into his barn, Tom received a package from Dr. Chen. Inside was a copy of her published research paper, titled Extraordinary Interspecies Maternal Behavior in Wild Bobcat, a Case Study. The paper detailed everything they had witnessed, complete with photos and video documentation, but what moved Tom most was the dedication, which read, "For Margaret Miller, who believed animals were capable of more than we imagined, and for Tom Miller, who gave them the space to prove her right." Emily came up that Sunday for dinner, as she did most weeks now. They sat in the kitchen, the same table where they had debated what to do about Luna, where they had tracked the kitten's development, where Margaret had once presided over family meals with her characteristic warmth. Tom showed Emily the paper, and they read through it together, reliving those remarkable weeks through Dr. Chen's careful scientific language. "You know what I think about most," Emily said when they finished reading. "It's not the scientific implications or the research value. It's that moment when Luna brought Shadow to me for treatment. She trusted us, Dad. A wild animal driven by every instinct to protect her young from humans trusted us to help." Tom nodded, understanding completely. Margaret would have said it proved what she always believed, that compassion isn't bound by species, that kindness recognizes kindness regardless of the form it takes. The Miller farm continued its quiet rhythm through the changing seasons, but Tom often found himself pausing in his work to look toward the barn, remembering the impossible family that had briefly made it their home. He had learned something profound during those weeks, something that defied easy articulation, but changed how he saw the world. The boundaries between wild and tame, between natural and extraordinary, between what was possible and what was supposed to be possible, were far more fluid than he had ever imagined. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the moon hung low over the Pennsylvania countryside, Tom would hear a distant sound carried on the wind, a cry that might have been a bobcat calling to her young, or might have been nothing more than his imagination. But real or imagined, it reminded him of Luna, of her desperate courage in saving orphaned kittens, of the trust she had placed in a lonely farmer and his daughter, of the proof that even in nature's harsh world, compassion could flourish in the most unexpected places in the most unlikely hearts.